On September 3, 1939, France and Great Britain declared war on Germany, following the invasion of Poland by the German army. That was the moment that forever changed the lives of hundreds of millions of people around the globe, in both belligerent countries and those that remained neutral. The largest and deadliest armed conflict in the history of humankind had begun. Of course, its impact was greater in the countries at war, and in particular, in Germany among those. But the truth is, civilian life in the Third Reich was already quite different since 1933, compared to the earlier periods of German history. The Nazi regime had reshaped the routines, ways of socializing and culture of the whole country. Away from the battlefields of World War II and heavily influenced by the omnipresent propaganda subtly crafted by Joseph Goebbels, the daily life of the common people during the Nazi dictatorship is not often talked about in history books. However, it is crucial to acknowledge how millions of Germans lived in order to understand why the rest of the population was willing to give their lives in the battlefield to protect the lifestyle of the Third Reich. After World War I, and before Adolf Hitler came to power, Germany was a flawed democratic republic known as the Weimar Republic. This period of 15 years was also marked by an unprecedented economic and social crisis. In 1919, the average income for German citizens was 25% below that of the years before the Great War. And between 1921 and 1923, a brutal hyperinflation hit the country. At its peak, Germans needed 1 trillion marks to buy only $1. The sight of people taking wheelbarrows full of cash money to the store to buy essential goods became common. By the time Hitler was made Chancellor of the Reich, the economy was in complete shambles. He made the promise that under his leadership, the German economy would thrive and that its benefits would reach every German citizen, but only if they were pure of race. The Nazis were very skillful in creating different scapegoats to explain the crisis, which explains the success of their political project. First it was the communists, then the Jews, but to a lesser degree Hitler also blamed the Germans' way of life throughout the Weimar Republic. In Hitler's view, the Weimar Republic was responsible not only for economic strife, but for a great cultural decadence that lasted years, which supposedly tainted the moral basement of the German people. The Nazis' political project did not just seek to improve the Weimar Republic's economy, but to completely dismantle the Weimar society and replace it with a new one, based on the principles of race and national tradition. The Nazi ideology was revolutionary, but also deeply irrational and power-oriented. And so, daily life changed drastically for 65 million Germans with the inauguration of the Third Reich in 1933. But Hitler's plans were more far-reaching than to include just the current population of Germany. The Nazi Party had taken an old expansionistic concept named Lebensraum and adopted it in their race towards a greater Reich that encompassed most of Central and Eastern Europe. Lebensraum can be translated as living space for German people. It was the idea that the Aryan race, which they thought superior to all the rest, had a natural necessity of a larger space than it had at the moment in order to develop fully. Some of that space was populated by undesirable peoples such as the Jews, but other areas were currently under control of other states. In every speech, Hitler highlighted the idea that the German people did not only have the need for a Lebensraum, but they also had the right to take it by force. Most young people sympathized with the aggressive, revolutionary aspects of this ideology, while older citizens were awfully aware of the territory that Germany lost after World War I and welcomed the opportunity to take it back. There was another reason why Adolf Hitler was so intent in telling the people that the true German Reich was much bigger than what the current borders indicated. He himself was not born in Germany, but in Austria, in a small town near the border with Bavaria called Braunau am Inn. So he was a foreigner in Germany, but only in the papers. He explained that being German is not a matter of birth, but of blood, and Austrians and Germans were united by their Aryan blood. This is why one of his first expansionist orders were to annex the country of Austria to the German Reich, as well as retaking some of the territories lost in World War I. Saarland went back to German control in 1935, and in compliance of the Munich Agreement of 1938, Germany recovered a region in Czechoslovakia named the Sudetenland. The Third Reich would eventually take the whole of Czechoslovakia and also invaded Poland in 1939, which was the event that sparked World War II. Back in Germany, most people seemed to approve of these necessary steps to reach the promised Great German Reich. But if German civilians imagined that the war would be confined to the battlefields and that early victories in Poland, France, Belgium, and the Netherlands would bring peace and prosperity on the home front, they were soon disillusioned. Rationing and shortages were just two of the many inconveniences imposed mainly on the German women in the early months of the war. Away from the battlefield, being a woman in the Third Reich. Long before the start of World War II, the Nazis decided to completely modify the place of women in civil society. According to the Nazi Party, women in the Weimar Republic had left their natural place as devoted housewives thanks to all the Social Democrats, Communists and Jews. They claimed that the governments that preceded Hitler had masculinized women by giving them the right to vote and to voice their concerns. They turned them into thinking beings with their own opinions, instead of the docile wives they were supposed to be. Moreover, not only they neglected their duties at home when they went out to find jobs, but they aggravated male unemployment and forced salaries to plummet. There was no place in the Third Reich for the so-called double earners. A man's salary was supposed to be enough to support any family. Of course, after the long and difficult years of the Weimar Republic, this did not seem like a loss of independence for women, but as a welcome respite in their daily struggle. Most women welcomed the possibility of not having to work long hours and have time to take care of the house and children. Hitler promised all workers that there would be jobs for every man and competitive salaries. And to a degree, these promises became a reality. But it was not just that Hitler wanted to keep women away from work. He passed legislation that restricted the percentage of women that could be admitted into universities. Since 1933, only 10% of all university places could be given to women, although some sources suggest these numbers were not always respected. Women were also excluded from the new leadership, and under the Nazi government, they could only aspire to become secretaries. Politics, at any rate, was not a suitable field for women. The task of the many Nazi women's organization was to lead women back into the traditional realms of the specifically feminine, to their natural duties and rights. Thus, the first step in the effort to create jobs in 1933 was to ease out women from the labor market and the universities. The introduction of marriage credits and child bonuses was part of the anti-emancipation campaign. Also, the Nazis implemented the so-called household year, which meant that every woman needed to complete at least a year of household work after they finished high school and before attempting to study at a university. But with the growing labor shortage after 1935, the paradoxical nature of these efforts became obvious, above all in regard to unmarried women. They were reabsorbed into the labor process and continued their impotent role in the labor market as during the Weimar Republic. The number of working women in 1938 rose to 5.2 million, from 4.24 million in 1933. An increasing number of women were employed in industry to support the war and to replace male combatants. Among women, there also was a growing trend to leave farms and migrate to the cities. With the beginning of the war, the number of women in the universities also increased. In the Third Reich, women's opportunities for advancement were very small, and they were paid incomparably less than men for performing the same work. They were also poorly represented in the civil service, at least before the war. But the original intention of the Nazis, which was to exclude women from the modern labor process, was defeated by the consequences of progressive industrialization and social and economic mobilization. Women's economic emancipation continued and even gained momentum in the course of the war. True, the political rights of women in the Third Reich were limited to plebiscitary assent, but that essentially was true of everyone. The undesired social byproducts of modernization implicit in the Nazi war policies affected women as well as men. Thus, in its fashion, the totalitarian state contributed substantially to the social mobility and equality that characterized the new social structure. One important aspect of the Nazis' political program was the necessity to re-educate women, including their sexual behavior. This would be achieved through a combination of state-sanctioned propaganda, private life surveillance through the Gestapo, and the collaboration of the common Germans. A full-scale effort to modify a society's way of behaving in private had never before seen in the history of humanity, and it was only comparable to the private surveillance and the terror deployed by the Inquisition between the 15th and 18th centuries. This affected mostly women in the cities, especially the bigger ones like Berlin and Munich, as they were the main beneficiaries of the sexual liberation brought by the Weimar Republic. Life in the small villages and towns scattered all over Germany was very different. The Nazi regime also brought tremendous changes to the lives of women in the village, but it was quite the opposite from what happened in the cities. The Nazis introduced village women to public life, they founded separate women's organizations, and they introduced a form of national service for girls. Such were the National Socialist Organization of Women, the League of German Girls, and the Labor Service. These organizations did not only have an ideological retraining function, they also allowed women to travel beyond the narrow confines of the village, brought them in contact with women from other regions, and made them cross social class boundaries. Furthermore, military and labor service helped to relax the principally endogamous marriage patterns which had prevailed in the village. In short, although it may seem contradictory, Nazism brought a certain liberation from the traditional confines of village life. The perfect German woman was a wife and a mother. Mother's Day itself became a major propaganda event and was made into a national holiday in 1934. Goebbels ordered all brown shirts, Hitler Youth and other Nazi party organizations to give their members the day off so that they could be with their families. Theaters were ordered to stage relevant plays on the day and give out free tickets to mothers and families. Priests and pastors were to preach sermons on motherhood. On Mother's Day in May 1939, 3 million women who had given birth to 4 or more children each were invested with the title of Mother of the Reich in special ceremonies held all over Germany. Their new status was signaled by the award of specially minted Mother's Honor Crosses, bronze for those with 4 children, silver for 6, and gold for 8 or more. This was an achievement considered sufficiently noteworthy for the crosses to be pinned on by Hitler himself. Wearers were allowed to jump queues in food stores, and Hitler Youth members were instructed to salute them in the street. Mothers whose performance exceeded even this, and who gave birth to 10 children, were given the additional honor of having Hitler as godfather of the 10th child, which in the case of boys meant naming the infant Adolf, something which Catholic families who resented Hitler's persecution of their church must have found somewhat distressing. Family fun in Nazi rallies, hearing Hitler's speeches. During the Third Reich, listening to Hitler's speeches was mandatory. Every school stopped classes to tune the radio to the official band, and the loudspeakers in every factory and office